So, we are back again with learning, and we are going to continue with the second kind of associative learning, which is called operant conditioning. Unlike classical conditioning, operant conditioning is thought to operate on voluntary behaviors rather than reflexive behaviors. And the association in operant conditioning, the brain areas that are getting linked up, are between a stimulus. So there's a situation or a stimulus that triggers a learned voluntary behavior. So the links that form uh, in classical conditioning are between conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus. In operant conditioning, they are between a stimulus, S, and a response, R, SR links, then CSUS links. The sort of origin of operant conditioning goes back to the US, um, and the person here uh, involved is Thorndike. Thorndike was interested in voluntary behaviors, and he, unlike Pavlov's dog, Thorndike used a cat. So he starves the cat, then he puts it inside a cage, and there's a cat can see outside, and there's a dish of food right outside the cage. Of course, the cat is starving. The cat goes wild, running around in the cage, and it accidentally presses a lever that opens the door. So the cat goes out and eats the food. Then Thorndike starves the cat again. Now, what you and I would presumably do is, and we're put in the same situation, we immediately go to the lever, press it, go outside again. That doesn't happen with the cat. So the cat is starved, put inside the cage again, food outside. Cat goes wild again, accidentally manages to press the lever, goes out and eats the food. Thorndike puts it in the cage again. Cat goes wild again, accidentally presses the lever, gets out. But Thorndike notices that the amount of delay, the amount of time the cat goes around running wildly, is slowly decreasing. And 20 or 30 times inside the cage, and as soon as the cat is in the cage, it presses the lever and gets out. It takes 20 or 30 tries. So Thorndike thinks that this is not really explainable by the cat thinking, oh, I should press the lever. It's not a cognitive phenomenon. He suggests it is the steady, slow growth of a neural link between the voluntary behavior of pressing the lever and the stimulus of being inside the cage. And he thinks this learning happens when the lever press is followed soon afterwards by a reward. In this case, the cat getting to eat the food. So the link that's forming here is between stimulus and a response. And this link forms if there is a reward, or as we later go on to call it, a reinforcement. It's the slow growth or stamping in of a neural link. And that's why, again, it's called of associative learning. And in this case, operant conditioning, in contrast to classical conditioning. Um, Now, the word reward, which Thorndike originally used, um, did not sit well with B.F. Skinner, who was a later behaviorist. He called himself a radical behaviorist. Uh, and he wanted to move away from any kind of a subjective terminology. He said that conditioning, he was the inventor of behaviorism as well as a general principle. And he said we should move away from the idea that there are internal brain states like the cat feeling happy or something like that. We should stick in terms of our theorizing completely on objectively verifiable events. So classical conditioning is two stimuli getting associated, conditioned and unconditioned stimulus, and the reflexive response is triggered by the conditioned stimulus after the association forms. In operant conditioning, a stimulus being inside the cage is linked to a voluntary response. इसके अंदर thoughts, feelings, emotions जो हैं irrelevant हैं, and that and this learning is triggered if there is what he calls a reinforcement, a event of a particular nature like eating food, which triggers the growth of a linkage. He said It's got nothing to do with the how the cat subjectively feels, whether it feels rewarded or satisfied or whatever. In fact, B.F. Skinner, as I said, behavior as a radical behaviorist, wanted to banish investigation of thoughts, feelings, and emotions completely from psychology. People think he claimed they didn't exist. He claimed they exist, but he claimed thoughts, feelings, and emotions were triggered by the operant conditioning mechanism as a side effect. They were not, you did not uh, press the lever because you remembered that there was nice food outside. You press the lever because the cage situation, that stimulus has been linked with the lever press, and any thoughts and emotions that happen during it are being caused by this mechanism, not a result of this mechanism. They're triggered by this mechanism. So there are, in a sense, they're a side effect or an epiphenomenon, not causally involved. That was his claim. And he made this claim for human operant conditioning phenomenon also. So for him, a reinforcement, which he used instead of a reward, is just an event that increases the likelihood of a behavior being shown. It's anything that somehow triggers the associative learning mechanism. And it's not trigger, it's not doing it via any subjective state. That was his claim. Similarly, um, he claimed, and the second part, as it were, of operant conditioning is that you can decrease the likelihood of some behaviors in certain stimuli. So you put a cat inside the box, and if it presses the lever and gets an electric shock, then next time it's less likely to press the lever. And a couple of tries, and pretty soon the cat will completely avoid the lever. It will avoid the lever, pressing the lever, if it's being followed by a punishment. So you have stimuli which can get positively linked with a behavior, a response, if it's followed by a reinforcement. And you have stimuli that can get inhibitory links with a response if the response has been followed by a punishment. So in simple terms, something like you're picking your nose in front of your parents and they slap you on the head, you're less likely to pick your nose in front of your parents. They are the stimulus. Nose picking was the response, followed by a punishment. The response becomes less likely in the presence of the stimulus. That's operant conditioning. And again, to contrast it with classical conditioning, it's voluntary responses. And the linkage that's forming is between a stimulus and a response if the response is being followed by a reinforcement or alternately a punishment. Now, this there's some conceptual and definitional sort of unpacking of the terms that we've looked at so far. The first of these is the idea of primary and secondary reinforcements and primary and secondary punishments. Something like food is a primary reinforcement. There's a natural tendency for food to act as a reinforcer to trigger the learning mechanism and cause a positive association to form between the stimulus and the voluntary behavior. A primary punishment, for example, pain or electric shock, again, requires no learning. It naturally tends to cause an inhibitory link to form between the stimulus and the response or the behavior. A secondary reinforcer does not have a natural learning impact. Its learning impact comes after an intermediate phase of learning. So something like um, good boy, well done. For a baby, this is not a reinforcer. Okay? As we'll go on to see, in certain situations it might be, but typically it's not. Okay? Why? Because the baby doesn't understand language. Once a baby learns to speak, now saying good boy, well done, or good girl, well done, um, would be a reinforcer, but it wasn't initially there. Some learning took place before the secondary reinforcers acquired their reinforcing powers. Um, what kind of learning? Well, as it happens, classical conditioning. So what are the words good boy? Good boy are a stimulus. They have repeatedly been linked by getting an ice cream because you've been a good boy with an ice cream, or you've been a good guy, a good boy. Um, you get to watch a lot of TV or whatever. Here's your iPad, good boy. Repeated pairings of this stimulus with a series of other primary reinforcers, and pretty soon this good boy, which was initially had no reinforcing effect, is acting as a reinforcer because it's become classically conditioned to primary reinforcers. Same thing with secondary punishments. The letter F for a young child is not a punishment. If I give you a letter F, on the other hand, it's a punishment. But it's a secondary punishment. It's been linked with a lot of primary punishments, your parents giving you a hard time. That's primary punishments for getting an F. It's gotten linked to those, and now it's A. It acts as a punishment. When a behavior is followed by that, the behavior is likely to go down. Obviously, there are complications to this, but in principle. So primary reinforcer is naturally has a reinforcing, it triggers the uh, operant conditioning learning mechanism. A primary punishment naturally does that as well. A secondary reinforcer um, acquires its switching off on of learning's reinforcing powers by being classically conditioned towards primary reinforcer or a series of primary reinforcers. Okay, that's primary and secondary. By the way, um, money is a very powerful secondary reinforcer. I can definitely, if I pay you 100 rupees every time, I'll have you increase the frequency of that behavior in my presence or whatever stimulus I've chosen. उसकी presence में जो भी behavior मैं reinforce कर रहा हूँ money से, it will get reinforced. So why is money such a classic primary reinforcer? Because money has been classically conditioned to a very wide variety of primary reinforcers. So you get money, you eat food. You get money, you get a drink. You have money, you watch a movie, you have money. Money has been repeatedly paired with a wide variety of primary reinforcers. It's not like, you know, Muhammad Ali Jinnah is a real hottie to look at, where he's not bad, but that's not how money is doing its job. It's doing its job by a series of classically conditioned links with a number of primary reinforcers. And that's why it's such a powerful secondary reinforcer. The second set of principles that we want to discuss are positive and negative reinforcers and positive and negative punishments. A positive reinforcer, the word positive here does not mean emotional context, कि बड़ा positive चीज थी. Positive here means introducing an event, and negative here means removing an event. So positive reinforcers are when you introduce something and that acts as a reinforcement. So you do something and I say, here's some ice cream. That's a positive reinforcer because I've introduced something positive and it's a reinforcer. Ice cream is good food, positive. A negative reinforcer would be something that's reinforcing, but I've removed something to cause the reinforcement. So you're sitting in an uncomfortable chair and I say, you've done well in the course, you can shift to the front row where they are really comfortable chairs. I've removed the discomfort and this will act as a reinforcement. And this is a negative reinforcer. The removal of something unpleasant acts as a negative reinforcer. Called negative because you're removing something. So positive means addition, negative means removal. Similarly, a positive punishment would be an electric shock would be a positive punishment. You introduce something and it's a punishment. Okay? A negative punishment would be removal of something. So, okay, you haven't done so well, give me back that ice cream. Not having that ice cream. I've removed something. And that's a negative punishment, the removal of something. Pleasant, typically, is a negative punishment. Ice cream is a bad example because, yeah, it works. But um, I can think of, let me think of other examples of negative punishments. Not being able to watch TV. would be a negative punishment. You remove the iPad. And that's your negative punishment. Okay. So this is the basic mechanism. Stimulus gets linked to a reward, to a response, voluntary response. Either positively, it activates the response, or negatively, it inhibits the response. And this is due to a reinforcement or a punishment. In the same way that people started to explore the broader mechanism of the classical conditioning mechanism, they explored the operant conditioning mechanism, and they found similar kinds of studies. So just as in classical conditioning, you can do extinction. A stimulus gets linked to a response due to repeated reinforcements. Cat presses the lever, gets out and eat food. Um, if you go into extinction trials, the cat presses the lever, goes outside, there's no food. Cat is inside the box, presses the lever, goes outside, there's no food. Couple of trials of that, and the cat will stop showing the behavior. You have extinction. Okay? In the same way, the idea here is extinction is due to an inhibitory link. Because just as in classical conditioning and operant conditioning also, you find spontaneous recovery. So let's say you put a coin inside a dispensing machine and get yourself a can of Coke and drink it, another coin, another Coke, and one day you put a coin and the machine goes and no Coke. You say, oh damn. And you put another coin, doesn't go out, no Coke. You forget about the machine and you ignore it for a couple of weeks, but then you're passing by, you suddenly put a coin in again. That's spontaneous recovery. You've don't shown the behavior again. We'll go a little bit later, we'll look at intermittent reinforcement as a concept and keep this idea in mind. So that's extinction, same way as in classical conditioning, including spontaneous recovery. Also similar to classical conditioning, you have stimulus generalization. So Thorndike puts a cat inside a box, presses a lever, gets outside and eat, does it repeatedly, cat is pressing the lever, it's done. Thorndike puts it in a slightly different box. Has the cat learned only in that box do I press a lever? Or has the cat learned in boxes in general press levers? Again, मैं इसको consciously describe कर रहा हूँ. In fact, what we are asking is, does any kind of a box-like stimulus get associated with the lever press behavior? And ignore the fact that the cat thinks or whatever. वो नहीं होता. So, does that happen? Just like in classical conditioning, you find stimulus generalization. Yes, the cat will press a lever in any stimulus-like situation, similar stimulus. There is as you make the stimulus more and more different, there's a decreasing probability of a lever press. वही normal curve आ जाता. Can you make an animal learn a discrimination? Not by simple repetition, just like in classical conditioning. So आप बार-बार एक ही box पे train करें कि शायद the cat will eventually learn through repeated exposure to this box कि यही वाला सिर्फ करना है, लेकिन नहीं, cat generalize करती रहती है. And if you want to make it learn a distinction, you have to put it inside a different box and do extinction trials. In a different box, when it presses the lever, there's no food outside, or the lever does not open the door. One of those two. So once you do those discrimination trials, then the cat will learn to only press it to the specific box that it's trained on. And in fact, with discrimination training, animals can learn very, very fine distinctions indeed. Pigeons have been taught only to press a lever with Picasso's painting and not anybody else's painting. Variety of paintings are shown. So they are recognizing some very, very fine distinctions in terms of the stimulus discrimination. That is the sort of general principles. There's also a phenomenon called discriminative stimulus. This is a stimulus that signals when a consequence is likely to happen. So what you can do is You can put a rat or a pigeon inside a box and they press a lever and they get out. But um, the lever press will only open the door when the light is switched on inside the cage. Animals will very soon learn this discriminative stimulus. You put them inside the cage, they'll hang around. As soon as the light switches on, they'll go outside. So they've learned in this stimulus, when that is present as well, you do the behavior. That's the associative chain that has happened. So something like, you learn to behave well, but only when your parents are present. So that's the discriminative stimulus के हाँ घर में अच्छी तमीज से रहते हैं लेकिन सिर्फ जब वो generally नहीं. So that would be a stimulus, discriminative stimulus. In many cases, you have to be very careful doing operant conditioning or operant training to make sure the wrong discriminative stimulus is not picked up. So a child doesn't just learn to behave well in front of parents or in front of teachers. You are hoping for a broader generalization of good behavior during learning. And that's something that a child psychologist or a developmental psychologist would be trained to make sure that sort of thing happens. Basically, you've got to give a reinforcement with a variety of stimuli that encourages generalization, and then the system sort of doesn't go into discrimination or discriminative stimulus mode. Okay, so far we have been talking about stimulus is there, behavior is shown, reinforcement is given. So there's one behavior and one reinforcement. This is called a continuous reinforcement schedule or a fixed ratio 1 schedule of reinforcement. But you can also have partial reinforcement schedules. In a partial reinforcement schedule, continuous reinforcement schedule, the FR1, fixed ratio 1 reinforcement schedule, the training very rapidly. Learning happens relatively fast. But you can, of course, increase the ratio. So you can have animal presses the lever. Once it lever press, you go outside, there's no food. Second time with lever press, there is food. Third time in lever press, there's no food. Fourth time there's lever press, there is food. So now you've got a fixed ratio 2 in which every 2 lever presses, there is a reinforcement. These are called partial reinforcement schedules. And it turns out most partial reinforcement schedules are very resistant to extinction. Once the animal their learning system gets exposed to the situation that every now and again on this, if I perform this behavior on this stimulus, in this stimulus, there'll be a reinforcement, then the behavior becomes relatively resistant to extinction. They'll keep on doing it. And this sometimes has been linked to what is called superstitious behavior. Superstitious behavior in animals, what you do is, let's say a pigeon is just, or a rat is just wandering around the cage, you give it a reinforcement, give it a food pellet. What happens is, आपने किसी behavior पे नहीं दी, but the animal will start copying the behavior it was doing just before it got the reinforcement. And as long as you occasionally give it a reinforcement, it will really get locked into that behavior. Pigeons, for example, can be a superstitious behavior. They go around, spinning around in circles because every now and again you give them a reinforcement, and that puts them in a partial reinforcement schedule for spinning. हालांकि आपने हर सूरत ही वो देना ही है फूड पैलेट, लेकिन वो behavior show करते रहते हैं. Something like having your lucky pen for an exam. यार पेन वो पेन चाहिए यार, वो lucky pen है मेरा, or lucky shorts for an exam. What's happened is, couple of times you had a good exam wearing them, and now you keep on wearing them. Bad exam happened, ये तो इस बार काम नहीं किया क्योंकि वो हो गया था, असल में तो ये lucky shorts ही नहीं, and you keep on wearing them. That's the idea. That's what we mean by, that's what psychologists call superstitious behavior in animals, and they suggest a lot of behaviors in humans also is superstitious. This has been tested with a rather interesting, this was quite an old test, so उसमें बड़ी simple video games होती थी. उसके अंदर joysticks थी, उसके बाद यूं करके joystick मिला सकते थे आप, and they had a couple of undergraduate students and they put them in front of the computer with a joystick, and they kept moving the joystick, and the ball kept pointing. Every now and again, they would say "Boom," and their points would go up. The points were going up after a certain amount of delay, and but the students pretty soon said, "I've got the system figured out. You do this, 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 and this, and there we go. There we go." So that's that again. Would be superstitious behavior, phenomenal superstitious behavior linked to partial reinforcement schedule. Now we explore this phenomenon of partial reinforcement schedules a little bit more. There are a variety of rules or kinds of schedule that you can follow in partial reinforcement schedule. Um, Fixed ratio 1 is a continuous reinforcement schedule. Fixed ratio 2 is partial, but you can also have fixed ratio 3. Every 3 times the animal does a lever press, it finds food outside. You can have fixed ratio 4. So you can have fixed ratios n. That is a variety of kinds of intermittent schedules. But the rule behind them is a certain number of behaviors, and you have the reinforcement given. What you have here is the behavior patterns of animals on FR, fixed ratios. This format actually goes back to Skinner. उस जमाने में जैसे computers नहीं होते थे, it was a simple technique that Skinner had developed to do experiments. He had a little roll of paper that was unwinding. जिस तरह वो seismoscope होती है, earthquake measure करती है, उसके ऊपर एक पेंसिल होती है, और जब वो पेंसिल हिलती है तो लाइन पड़ जाती है seismograph पे. जब earthquake नहीं है तो flat line है, earthquake है तो हिल जाती है. He rigged up something simple, so there was a little mechanism by which paper kept on churning, and he would fill a box, attach it to a cage of food pellets, and he would attach it to the lever, and he would put a rat inside, and he would leave for the evening. Every time the rat pressed the lever, the food pellet would come in, and the rat would eat it. And the rat pressing the lever would call the needle to move. And so Skinner would come in the morning and look at the scroll of paper and find a learning kaisi gayi overnight. It didn't have to be there for the learning to monitor the rat all the time. And this is how I actually discovered intermittent schedules. One day he was about to leave and he realized he didn't have enough food pellets. So he rigged up his system कि हर 2 दफा the lever press करता था तो एक food pellet मिलती. Now this is what he found in fixed ratio. This is how the behavior is shown. The rats would keep on lever pressing until they got the food pellet, and then they would relax for a bit. No lever presses. And then they would start pressing the lever again until they got a food pellet, and then they would relax again. So this stepped line is the animal's learned behaviors under fixed ratio. Then he also tried variable ratio. Fixed ratio 2 होती है 2 lever presses, 1 food pellet. Variable ratio 2 होगी on average every 2 lever presses, food pellet. कई दफा 3 पे हो जाएगी, कई दफा 1 पे ही मिल जाएगा, लेकिन on average every 2 lever presses will lead to a reinforcement. That's variable ratio 2. You can have variable ratio 3. On average, every 3 lever presses will give you a reinforcement. Sometimes 1, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 5. But on average, हर 3 के बाद मिलेगी. Variable ratio जो थी, यहाँ पे लिखा हुआ उसकी response rates आए हैं, इतने हाई नहीं होते. Fixed ratio के बराबर होते हैं या जरा से कम होते हैं. Variable ratio. The point about variable ratio is it is much more resistant to extinction than fixed ratio. Fixed ratio 2 is a little bit resistant to extinction, but variable ratio 2 is more resistant to extinction than fixed ratio 2. So variable ratio is more resistant to extinction. You want some behavior to last a long time, you should reinforce it intermittently using a variable ratio. Skinner also tried fixed interval reinforcement. Fixed interval क्या होता है? Fixed, let's say fixed interval 30 seconds. What is fixed interval 30 seconds? It means every 30 seconds the animal will receive a reinforcement provided they have shown the behavior at least once in the previous 30 seconds. Animal is inside the cage. As long as it pressed the lever at least once in the previous 30 seconds, a food pellet will appear, but no more than that. So if the animal is always pressing the lever, every 30 seconds a food pellet will appear. That's the fixed part, fixed interval 30 seconds. It can be fixed interval anything. Fixed interval 10 seconds आप कर सकते हैं, 1 minute कर सकते हैं. लेकिन interval अगर आपने fix कर दिया तो वो fixed interval कहलाती है. Under fixed interval, this is the behaviors shown by the animal. So animal is lever press, lever press, lever press, lever press, lever press, lever press, interval food pellet. Pause, lever press, lever press, lever press, lever press, lever press, lever press, food pellet. These are called scalloped curves. They're curves. The animal has a low response rate that starts increasing in frequency around the time that the pellet is expected. It reaches its maximum, gets the food pellet, relaxes. Then a couple of lever presses and they start going up in frequency very rapid until it gets that. So think of yourself. Let's say you're trying to find what your grade is. You check, there's nothing on Zambil. You check again, nothing on Zambil. And then slowly your frequency rises as you expect it to be there. And finally you see it. That would be, that pattern of scalloped behaviors is what you see with fixed interval patterns of reinforcement. Just like with variable fixed ratio and variable ratio, you also have a variable interval of reinforcement. Variable interval 30 seconds would mean on average an animal will see a reinforcement provided it's done the behavior once. कई दफा 10 सेकंड पे मिल जाएगी, कई दफा 40 सेकंड पे मिलेगी, कई दफा, but on average every 30 seconds एक reinforcement मिल जाएगी. With variable interval, it is the most resistant to extinction of all of these schedules of reinforcement. So you want your kid to read a book, every now and again randomly give them 100 rupees. Did you read a book in last week? Here's 100 rupees, enjoy yourself. It's very resistant to extinction. I'm not saying that, okay, let's discuss whether you should reward your children with money or to get them into the habit of reading books later on. But the point is, anything with a variable interval ratio of reinforcement, a variable interval pattern of reinforcement is going to be extremely resistant to extinction. Animals have actually been, with using variable intervals, they've been put into situations where they're expending more calories doing lever presses than they're getting from the food pellets. They're literally working themselves to death using variable intervals. It's a very, very resistant to extinction, which is why if you're trying to get someone to stop a behavior, it's very important to be consistent in giving a learning signal. अगर आप variable interval पे देंगे, so that behavior is more likely to become severely entrenched. Okay? That's the takeaway here. So those are the intervals or schedules of reinforcement. The problem, as it were, with operant conditioning is कि पहला behavior जो है, you have to wait for it before you get a reinforcement. Now with a simple thing like a lever press, ये तो बहुत आसान है. लेकिन if you want to do a complicated behavior like making a rat learn a maze, maze के अंदर 9-10 turns हैं before it reaches the end state. That's a very slow. You'll have to spontaneously wait for it. And remember, पहली दफा attempt, पहले reinforcement पे learning नहीं हो जाती. Multiple attempts करने पड़ते हैं. So it can be very slow. But there's a way of speeding it up, which is called behavior shaping. In behavior shaping, you typically use when there's a complex behavior to be learned, you will initially reinforce subcomponents of that behavior. So let's start with something very simple. So you put an animal inside a cage, lever press karne. An animal might want, if it's not, it might run around the cage for 10-15 minutes before it eventually presses the lever accidentally, maybe even longer. But what you do is, when the animal accidentally faces the lever, you'll give it a food pellet right there. Okay? Now, this is a very simple behavior. Animal rapidly learns it, 1 or 2 tries and they've learned. Now, once they learned it, now you shift the goalpost. Now you wait for the animal to turn in that direction. Animals typically after turning, they pause and they'll maybe take a few steps in that direction. Once they take a couple of steps, then you give it the reinforcement. तो पहले सिर्फ टर्निंग पे थी, अब आपने जब वो सीख लिया तो टर्निंग प्लस 2 steps पे आपने. Again, it's a simple addition to the previous one. Animals will learn it very rapidly. Then you wait it's almost when it has approached the lever before you give it the reinforcement. So at each stage, you are shifting the goalposts. These are called successive approximations of the target behavior. Using these, you can do a massive rapidity in learning complex behaviors. So you can make an animal learn a maze inside a day by using successive behavior shaping, successive approximation. आपने फिल्मों में देखा होगा animals doing these crazy things, it's pulling bars, jumping through hoops, पानी में swim कर रहा है, ये कर रहा है, वो कर रहा है. Those animals have all been trained using operant conditioning and using behavior shaping as a tool for successive approximation to learn a long, complicated sequence of behaviors. क्योंकि आप बैठ नहीं सकते कि पहली दफा perform spontaneously कर लेगा, फिर मैं उसको food कर दूँ. By many orders of magnitude, learning is sped up by doing behavior shaping. So, at the height of behaviorism, um, psychologists had thought that all human behaviors are going to be completely explained by classical and operant conditioning. Mental events are, you know, mental events are side effects. They're not causally involved in behavior. They are triggered by the learned associative sequences. उनका side effect होती है that you feel or think of something. उनको हमें study करने की जरूरत नहीं है. If our goal is to understand, explain, and predict behavior, control, explain, and predict behavior, हमें जरूरत नहीं है. They thought they would do everything, and all behaviors would ultimately be explained by that. But then, as I said, right in the module 1, phenomenon started appearing that couldn't be explained by associative learning, by the classical and operant conditioning. So, for example, Breland and Breland again taught pigs to pick up coins and deposit them and get food. But then they noticed pigs, instead of depositing the coins, were pushing them along with the nose, rubbing the ground and covering the coins with dirt and then digging them out with the nose again. And Breland and Breland called this instinctive drift. You see, pigs find their food by rooting, by digging out roots and fruits that are buried in the ground and digging them out. And because the coins have been linked repeatedly, classically conditioned with food, their instinctive behaviors towards food were being triggered towards these coins, and that was interfering with the associatively learned behavior towards the coin. So this was called instinctive drift. Now we'll come back to a variety of behaviors that could not be explained by associative learning, classical or operant conditioning. But first, let's look at a couple of applications of operant conditioning. Operant conditioning has been hugely, it's still the single most useful mechanism we have to directly change behavior. So if you want people's habits to change, operant conditioning is the way to go. It's been used to train people to get rid of bad habits. It's been used with patients in mental hospitals who have sort of self-injurious behavior. You can use careful reinforcement schedules to minimize and get rid of that behavior. They've been used to put in positive behavior. So someone who's become extremely antisocial, you can train them to show more and more pro-social behaviors using reinforcement patterns. And this technique is generally called behavior modification, in which you put in some behavior, habitual behavior that wasn't there by giving reinforcements, or you eliminate some unpleasant habitual behavior by removing reinforcements or putting in mild punishments. I'll talk a little bit more about punishments. Behavior modification also is a part of, in any situation, trained behavior modification psychologists would go in and see what are the natural patterns of reinforcement that are existing in the situation. Maybe the behavior is there because there's an unforeseen, unattended reinforcement pattern. So, for example, very young children um, it's sometimes throw tantrums. And if it gets bad, then a child development psychologist called in. And very often, more often than not, what you notice is that a child is being ignored when they're behaving well. कि शुक्र है 2 सेकंड के चुप हुआ है, बस जाती है. As soon as they start yelling and screaming and fighting, now everybody's paying attention. Unfortunately, social attention is a primary reinforcer. It's a very powerful primary reinforcer. So in fact, children are being reinforced for bad behaviors. And a psychologist then would intervene and they would say, okay, as soon as the child quiets down, pay them a lot of attention. And then cut back the attention when they start to misbehave. So you change the existing reinforcement pattern of attention. Social reinforcement, social attention also is not just in children, in adults also, it is the engine of social exchanges. Suppose you're not in lockdown and you walk up to me and you're talking to me. And suppose this is what I'm doing. Oh yeah, that's very interesting. Hmm. Oh, is that so? Acha. And what else did you do? Now this conversation will continue. Okay? Because I'm giving you a lot of social reinforcement. Now assume you walked up to me and you're talking, and this is what I'm doing. Uh-huh. Hmm. Did you? Hmm. Acha. Hmm. Hmm. That conversation is going to die down. We all are very, very sensitive to these social reinforcement patterns. And that's what keeps our social exchanges fluid, as it were. Uh, Part of people with poor social skills that makes other people, that makes them uncomfortable to deal with and makes them feel uncomfortable is if they're not paying attention to and responding to social reinforcement signals. So someone is talking to you, आप कर रहे हैं और बोली जा रहा है और अपना 10 मिनट की कॉन्वर्सेशन खत्म करता है अच्छा फिर मैं चलता हूँ. Now you're going to avoid this person. And a lot of cases, these people don't know what I mean. Nobody's with people in LUMS are not very friendly. They're all avoiding me. It's because there's a pattern that they are not responding to. So for most of it comes very naturally. But a lot of part of behavior modification in as a technique in psychology involves teaching people how to give reinforcement patterns for people they do want to engage with, and how to read other people's reinforcement patterns to know when other persons run out. So there are people who really want to talk to you, but they're not giving reinforcement patterns, social attention, and then they don't understand why nobody seems to be very to like talking to them. And so a lot of therapy in terms of social skill training is helping people give and recognize social reinforcement patterns, social attention as reinforcement patterns, and to work on that. It doesn't mean that they just have to pay attention to it. They don't have to consciously act according to it. शुरू में करना पड़ता है, but once they start working on it, it becomes a part of our sort of implicit learned system. It becomes a part of our conditioning system. But not everyone picks up the conditioning as easily as others. Some people need a little bit of help with that. So um, that is behavior modification. I want to pick up on the use of punishment, application of punishment. The first thing that one can talk about using punishment to do learning is the most important point to take home is that consistency has a far more powerful outcome than intensity. तो आप 4 दफा बच्चे ने बदतमीजी की, आपने इग्नोर कर दिया, 5 दफा उसको ठपा, that's a bad learning signal. You should, if you just say no, but do it every time, that consistent small punishment is going to produce a much more powerful learning effect than a intermittent intense punishment. Um, And in fact, it's been shown that if you intermittently punish and slowly scale up the intensity of the punishment, that's the worst outcome of all. Rats, for example, will immediately, if they're consistently trained, learn to avoid a part of a cage if they're given a 5-volt shock. If they're given the shock intermittently and the shock is slowly increased, they're still going into that part of the cage with a 110-volt shock. So intermittent with increasing intensity is actually the worst pattern of use of punishment. Um, and this intermittent pattern and increasing intensity also leads to resistance to extinction of the behavior. Basically, because every time you don't get the punishment counts as a reinforcement. And therefore, it's intermittent reinforcement और इससे वो बहुत rigid हो जाता है pattern. जिनके लोगों के बच्चे कभी कभार उनको पिटाई करते हैं, आमतौर से इग्नोर करते हैं, वो more often than not काफी ढीठ होते हैं. That would be the received wisdom, which is perfectly in line with what operant conditioning experiments are telling us. There are other problems with the use of punishment, which is why it's more or less being phased out in a lot of countries. There are a lot of side effects in the CPM. So animals that are trained using punishment pick up the behavior, but they avoid the behavior, but they will show aggression and violence and antisocial behaviors outside the learning situation. So they become misbehaved, generally misbehaved animals, because the punishment is stressful and sort of stress has lots of side effects. And also, punishment tends to very rapidly switch into discriminative stimulus control. So, माँ बाप डांटते हैं तो माँ बाप के सामने वो बंद हो जाता है, बाहर बंद नहीं होता. Typically, punishment has poor information content, so you don't know what you're getting punished to. Particularly because punishment, because it causes stress, causes cognitive processing to shut down. So आप जब बच्चे को डांट रहे होते हैं ना, तो बच्चा उसे अगला पिछला सब भूल गया, वो सिर्फ आप डांट सुन रहे. And you'll be lucky if eventually sort of come cognitive system starts functioning to the extent that अच्छा मुझे उस वजह से डांट पड़ रही है, हो. So that interferes in many ways. Certainly it shuts down the cognitive element, which is also influencing behavior. हम सिर्फ conditioning की बात कर रहे हैं, लेकिन there's a second mechanism that influences behavior, which is cognition. वो तो बिल्कुल punishment typically shuts it down. Also, in many cases, you can have accidental reinforcement in punishment. Punishment is certainly very focused social attention. So that may actually sort of balance out, cause as much reason to do the behaviors, which you can see in children as well. So don't drop it, I'll punish you. Right? So they love the attention as well. Punishment to baad mein hoti hai. So that for all these reasons, particularly the behavioral side effects outside of the learning situation are thought to be very negative. So punishments in schools certainly has been phased out in most places. You can do a lot of things by consistent reinforcement. You can even use reinforcement to stop a behavior. Let me give you an example of this. Incidentally, you can use any preferred behavior to reinforce any less preferred behavior. So homework karo to phir aap video game khel sakte. That's the principle, right? Now once I was called in to do a substitute teaching and it was outside, not in Pakistan. And of course, kindergarten tha. Kindergarten mein substitute teacher aaye to bacche जानवर बन जाए. I have got 15 kids yelling and screaming. Sit quietly for 5 minutes and do this, and then you can run screen for 7 minutes. Really? We can do it in class in front of you, run screen? Yes. But first you do this. So they all sat down, did, and then I said, okay, end of your game. Now back again, do this work 5 minutes. And I slowly worked it up so that by the end they were sitting quietly for 15 minutes at a stretch, which is the best you can get with kindergarten. I can get with kindergarten. And then they were being reinforced by 3 minutes of time under my supervision. Right? So you can use you can bring down the frequency of our behavior with the right reinforcement, including that own behavior. So um, the punishment is not the only option for lowering the frequency or removing a behavior. And there are other options, and punishment has side effects. There are also things that you need to be wary about with rewards. So you've got to be rewarding the right behavior. It's become one of the ways in which behavior, sort of reinforcements have become problematic is it's thought that बच्चों को बुरे ग्रेड नहीं देने चाहिए या उनको मौके मौके पे प्राइजेस बहुत सारे देने चाहिए because it keeps their self-esteem high. Now that's the wrong thing to reinforce. Self-esteem is not shown to be linked with academic progress and increasing competence. Resilience is reinforcing competence, these both, but simply giving reinforcement to keep their esteem up has been shown to be unhelpful, and children become more fragile. They become less capable of putting in sustained effort because sustained effort is hard to do and sometimes it's unpleasant to do. Um, they become too used to constant feedback and they struggle and get challenged. So if you're going to give reinforcements, you should give reinforcements for resilience, for increasing competence, rather than with the goal of just keep it going and keep their esteem up. That shouldn't be the goal. That can be counterproductive. Linked to this, another way in which reinforcements can sometimes be problematic is that when you provide a reinforcement, that reinforcement is extrinsic. It is coming from the outside. Whereas in a lot of educational and other situations, we would, the way to a high level of competence is by making the reinforcements intrinsic. And unfortunately, sometimes extrinsic reinforcements can interfere with that. There's a famous study in which kids were shown there were some ordinary pencils that they could play with, or there were these very nice felt tip markers that they play with. One group was allowed to play with both. Another group was allowed to play with both. और जिन्होंने वो felt tip markers use किए उनको बाद में एक present मिला के that's your present for me using those markers. The same thing is brought in again. The ones who have received a present for using the markers had a lower tendency to use them because they had gotten an extrinsic reinforcement. They hadn't focused so much on the pleasure of using these very nice markers, and also they had got an idea कि ये अगर इसकी वजह से आपको present मिलता है तो इसका मतलब है कि ये कोई फारिग ही काम है कि आपको अभी पेमेंट देनी पड़ती है, and they tended to have a less use of this. Remember I talked about book reading. If you really want to encourage reading, you can start off with a little bit of extrinsic reinforcement, but we should rapidly move on to intrinsic reinforcement, to discussing and enjoying the contents of the book with children. And that leads to a much longer and much more internally sustained pattern of behavior because the reinforcements start coming from the action of reading itself. Once they're trained to focus on the pleasure that they're getting from doing the reading, that's an intrinsic reinforcement, and that leads to a much more long-lasting behavior. You don't even have to be there for the reinforcements to continue to happen. So that is some applied sides to reinforcements and punishments and operant conditioning. Now I mentioned that, and several times I mentioned that behaviorism as a project failed in the sense it didn't explain all of behavior. And people soon discovered, as we now know, that there are separate pathways, cognitive pathways, which also influence behavior. And those are directly involved in behavior. They're not epiphenomenal. And they are to be understood separately. The first hints of this come very early. Tolman, who called himself a behaviorist because he was interested in describing behavior, nonetheless showed in his studies that you couldn't leave out mental phenomenon in attempting to explain behavior. And this was a phenomenon he called latent learning. He had three groups of rats, and they both learned to run through a maze for 20 days. He trained them for a maze of 20 days. The difference was group one, when it reached one point in the maze for all 20 days, found reinforcement, food. And these animals learned the maze. The second group of animals never got reinforcement anyway, and they sort of wandered around in the maze. The third group of animals, for the first 10 days, did not receive any reinforcement for wandering through the maze. On the 11th day, they found food. From the 11th to 20th days, they got reinforcement. Now, these first group, reinforcement all the time. Second group, no reinforcement. Third group, reinforcement after half the days of training are over. This second group, almost immediately their performance became the same as the first group. So Tolman explained this by saying that they've caught up so rapidly because in their non-reinforced wanderings about the maze, learning was taking place. They were learning a mental representation of the maze. They were learning their way around the maze, even though they were getting no reinforcement. And on the 10th day, once they start getting the reinforcement, their behavioral ability very rapidly matches the animals who've been reinforced from the beginning because they've already got the mental map and they use it and their behavior rapidly catches up. But this required knowledge state of the rats as being causally involved in behavior. So this was a problem for pure associative learning theory, where the classical operant condition, उसके अंदर simple brain connections were the machinery of learning. ये thoughts and ideas and mental maps जो थी, they had they didn't know how to handle it theoretically and they tried to ignore it. But they started finding more and more examples of behavior in which mental states like expectations clearly were playing a role. I talked in module 1, I talked about chimpanzees. They learn to open a puzzle if there is a lettuce inside. But if they see a chimpanzee next door open the same puzzle and get grapes, and they really like grapes, now they break the puzzle rather than opening it. So they have an expectation, usko wo mil raha hai, mujhe ye mil raha hai, that's unfair. That's the only way to explain their behavior. So, and these are mental states. And so they are causally linked in a lot of behaviors, not epiphenomenal. And this is what led to the rise of socio-cognitive learning theory, which is a mixture of associative learning theory, but we also have cognitive, assume that they are cognitive mechanisms in which you have long-term memory of spaces, of events like who's getting what reinforcement, what reward, and so on. So you have expectations, you have mental maps, and all of that. And that becomes a part of the overall learning system. And behavior in some cases would involve retrieving an expectation or retrieving a mental map, using that to make a decision and showing that behavior. In fact, both associative learning systems and cognitive systems run side by side. And they both influence behavior. Sometimes one captures behavior, sometimes the other, sometimes there's a combination of the two. And sort of modern day psychologists learn to use both of them. Just to, in terms of an example, even in animals like rats and so on, you have vicarious conditioning. So this is an animal will see another animal do a behavior, get a reinforcement for it. They'll immediately copy that behavior. They've never received a reinforcement. They've copied a full behavior. That implies they could watch an animal, make a mental model of its behavior, store it away, and when their own turn came, they would retrieve that from memory and copy that behavior. So it's not simple linking of brain regions happening. There is a set of mental symbols that is stored away and then retrieved and used to trigger behavior. So vicarious learning requires sort of at least there's some debate about it, but most cognitive psychologists will say it requires knowledge states, internal knowledge states to explain it. Children, of course, show lots of behavior modeling. They copy the behavior of those around them. Very famously, there's a Bandura study of a doll. So a child watches, a doll getting beaten up and somebody stealing all their goodies, and they go into then experimental situation. There's the same doll. Child immediately picks up a stick, gives it a good beating, And one of them even asked for, where's my sack? Because in the TV, they had seen the goodies being loaded into a sack and taken away. So that clearly shows mental ideas and expectation knowledge states are guiding the behavior, not just simple growth of associations followed by reinforcements and punishment, etc. So that is the topic of learning, and um, hope that sort of had lots of practical pointers in terms of your life, how you may change your habits or you may change the habits of others, or what's a good child rearing technique or things like that. All right, so that's it. Thank you.